So I've had to relocate to a parking lot. I'm parked outside of a Target close to my home, and it's because my neighbors are being so disruptive with the noise that it was assaulting my senses. So I really had to get out of my house, quite literally, because I couldn't tolerate it anymore. So here I am, and this will have to do. I wanted to address this comment I received recently. So the Dudeser, you said, I would like to get your aspect on how you deal with the shadow, the negativity, etc., besides meditation. So I thought I would just tell you. And that's a very good question. It's a complicated question for me because it involves, for what has been, at least in my experience, a lot of practice and spiritual practice in my case. And I understand that everybody copes with things in their own way. You all know that meditation and yoga is a huge part of my life, my daily existence that I rely on. But I have certainly in the past, before I became more skilled, I guess I should say, a more skilled practitioner of yoga and meditation, where I could implement it in such a way that it was truly helping me and not just going through the motions, which I did for a long time, which is better than nothing, I have to say. I think going through the motions of wanting to help oneself and wanting to grow and learn is certainly better than not, in my opinion, especially if that is something that is not hurting me and it's going to potentially bring calmness into my life and help me in some way. But to address your comment, the Dudeser, is that a Big Lebowski reference? I'm not sure. Maybe I'm being presumptuous. At any rate, I practice what is called radical acceptance. If you're familiar with Tara Brach, Marsha Linehan, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, I would recommend you look that up. You can do your own research. I encourage you always to do your own research about anything. But Marsha Linehan, she's a cognitive psychologist, and she combined the practices of CBT with Buddhist philosophy, and she created dialectical behavioral therapy, which, of course, appeals to me very strongly and resonates with me very intensely because of my background and the things that I'm just naturally gravitating towards. So again, I'm simply always sharing my life and my experience with you. This is not to push any beliefs on anyone. I never want to do that, actually. No matter what I'm ever talking about, I'm simply sharing. I don't want anyone, in fact, you should not follow me, nor should you follow anybody. I would always encourage people to do their own independent research, gather the knowledge, and then find your own way and practice that way. I do practice DBT. I have a workbook at home. There are many workbooks you can get. And I journal. That's another thing I do daily. So I take 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes. And I like to do this in the morning, preferably. But I journal actually whenever I need to. But I do this as a practice in the morning, certainly, to write down what I'm grateful for. And then I write down my intentions for the day. And then I kind of empty out my container and put things on paper so that I can have optimal executive function, so that I can do my daily activities in a way that will be the most productive and fulfilling for me. So in DBT, one of the biggest premises, and this is what Tara Brach also talks about, is this concept of radical acceptance. And so as not to keep you because I could actually talk about radical acceptance for hours, and don't worry, I won't. Radical acceptance, in short, at least my interpretation of it, is basically acknowledgement of reality. That's what my takeaway is. So whatever that is, and that may sound very simple and that I'm minimizing it, but I'm really not. When you study this premise, this radical acceptance, it is just simple acknowledgement of the reality. And so therein comes the practice of not resisting, not torturing yourself, I will use me, not torturing myself with my desires to change or alter that reality to my liking or my preference or my comfort level. If an issue is pressing on me, or I'm feeling stress, or I'm ruminating on a thought, these are all things that I often experience, especially the thought rumination, because I'm a thinking addict. And so the way I kind of get out of that being stuck is this radical acceptance. And I do think that the simplest things in life are often the hardest. I've said this before, but losing weight is a good example of that, because we all know how to lose weight, right? We eat mindfully, we eat conscientiously, and we move our bodies. But if it were that easy, there wouldn't be so many people with excess weight being carried on their bodies. So this is not a very easy thing. It is simple, however. So again, that is why I like this, and I also like it because it ties in to my background, which is Buddhism and yoga philosophy. And I will end on this, because I think if you are at all familiar with Buddhist philosophy, you will know this story, because it's perhaps one of the most commonly told stories. And I was told this story in a very lovely way when I was doing my teacher training. We were given an oral recount of this story, and it was so beautiful. And it's the story of tea with Mara. And I think this, having tea with Mara, or inviting Mara for tea, this story in Buddhist philosophy perfectly illustrates the premise of radical acceptance. And to put it succinctly, hopefully, on the eve of the Bodhisattva's enlightenment, so before he became a Buddha, on the eve of that event, he was bombarded with self-doubt, with ugliness, with desires unmet, self-hatred, self-loathing, all of these shadows. So shadow thoughts, negativity, he was bombarded with this. So his mind was ailing, and he had to sustain himself in this so that he may be enlightened. And he reached enlightenment, but the following morning, and for the 50 years thereafter, so this is after he attained enlightenment, that's very important. So he was an enlightened being, right? He was awakened and supposedly free of all this suffering. But he wasn't, because for the 50 years thereafter, every time Buddha was teaching underneath the tree, he was teaching his students, there would be lurking in the bushes, in the trees, in the shadows, the demon god, the shadow god, Mara. Mara was lurking always. And Ananda, who was Buddha's beloved servant and friend, confidant, Ananda would come and try and warn Buddha and say, there's the shadow god, Mara. You need to draw your attention to Mara. He's going to ruin this teaching, and he's going to basically get in the way of what you're trying to do here. And Buddha would basically say to Ananda, no, I've set out a cushion here, and in fact I've poured a cup of tea for Mara, and I am inviting Mara to have tea with me here. There's no need to resist, and there's no need to shoo him away. And so hopefully you get what I'm trying to say here. This story has been told far more eloquently than I just attempted to do, but the gist of the story hopefully is resonating. And that's a very powerful story. Is it not? I think it is, because when we are tortured with the shadows of our thoughts, the mind, the negativity of the mind, or the world for that matter, external forces, when all these things come and invade our space or invade our, take up real estate in our mind, or present stress that seems insurmountable or impossible to cope with, that we can practice how Buddha practiced, with compassion for that, and not resist it or push it away, but acknowledge it for what it is and acknowledge the reality of it. And even might we be able to invite that? Can we set a cushion down for the shadow God to sit beside us and be with us and make peace with that? I think we can. I've done this many times in my life, and it's brought me great relief, especially in the moment when I'm meditating. My mom and I are always joking about this when I, confide in her and my heart is in disarray or my mind is otherwise preoccupied in a negative way. She is always reminding me, tapping me on my shoulder. She's always saying, Jennifer, let Mara in, let him in. And I have to be reminded, and she does remind me often, so often. And it's a very good lesson, because that compassion, showing yourself compassion and showing Mara compassion, it's a very important practice, I find. And so that's what I do, simply. I mean, like I said, it's not easy, especially when I'm in the throes of catastrophe, or what I deem as catastrophe, so same thing. It's not easy, and sometimes I have to go and get a Dairy Queen Blizzard, and sometimes I do that, and I just consume something that will give me a dopamine hit, that I can have some pleasure, like a creature comfort that will give me pleasure. So I do those things too. I just did that yesterday, in fact, but I don't know if that quite answers your question, the dudeser, but that's my answer to your question. So I don't know if that was the answer you were seeking, but nonetheless, that is what I do. I practice radical acceptance, and I practice DBT skills. Again, if DBT sounds, dialectical behavioral therapy, if that sounds at all appealing to you, I do encourage you to do your research, Google it, and do some investigation, because it's been since I stopped doing traditional therapy years ago, I have been doing this practice on my own, implementing the practices of DBT. So I guess it's self-help. I guess that would technically be what it is. I don't use that term. It seems like such a trite way to put it, self-help, because it's so much more than that. But for the purposes of calling it something, I suppose that's what I'm doing. And it does help, for sure. And that's it for now. So I'm going to go back home, actually, because I wanted to film this video in my home, but like I said, the disruption with the noise in my environment, in my living space, it was presenting an obstacle for me. So I removed myself temporarily, and that's why I'm taping in my car. Hopefully you guys don't mind, but I'm going to go back home now, and I have a meeting actually in about 20 minutes. So hope you're all well. I shall see you soon, or rather you shall see me soon. Goodbye.